for joining me today for Part 2, Secrets of the Ho Chi Minh Trail today. In this episode, I'm going to take you to one of the most amazing Vietnam War relics in existence, something few people will ever see. Two massive North Vietnamese petroleum tanks still hidden deep in the jungle mountains inside an extremely remote jungle canopy-covered cave on the Ho Chi Minh Trail inside Laos, just a few miles from the Vietnamese border. One quick note before we begin. After the first video, I remembered that I failed to point out a very obvious fact about the war in Laos, which was, it was the communist North Vietnamese that first weaponized the country of Laos, making it an active combat zone in the Vietnam War. I realized the U.S. did massive damage to the Lao civilian population, and that was, and is, a tragedy. But as history well records, had the North Vietnamese not decided to use Laos as its invasion route into South Vietnam, then Laos would have remained neutral, as it was supposed to have been after the 1962 Geneva Accords, in which the U.S. did pull out from Laos all of its U.S. Army and Air Force elements. The North Vietnamese instead kept 7,000 to 9,000 troops inside Laos, violating the 1962 Accords, continuing to develop the Ho Chi Minh Trail as its assault corridor into South Vietnam. Now, that is just fact. One of the most impactful ways the North Vietnamese were able to mature their invasion route into South Vietnam and project combat capability deep inside that country was through the construction of petroleum pipelines throughout the Ho Chi Minh Trail to push petroleum and diesel products south. They needed, and thus constructed, huge petroleum storage tanks, many hidden inside caves, and because these tanks were so large, it was difficult to camouflage them from U.S. attacks. Laos is a country with a huge number of caves in the porous, karst limestone mountains, so these caves offered both cover and concealment for the petroleum storage tanks. 50 years after the war, most tanks have almost certainly been cut up and sold for scrap metal by local villagers and thus no longer exist. But Digby and Kai, through research and lots of motorcycle saddle time, discovered two petroleum tanks still intact, sitting side by side in a cave. The cave mouth was so small compared to the tanks that clearly the tanks were constructed inside the cave. Based upon his research, Digby suspected there was another cave in the same area with at least one more storage tank, so together we went out in search of it. In video 1, we left off with Kai talking to local villagers in the suspected area, inquiring about the existence of a second cave with a storage tank. Kai found two local guys who claimed to know about this second cave. So we put some petrol in their empty motorcycle with a promise of money if they took us there. I don't know why, but they told Kai that they wanted a pic with me, so we took one. Here are our fine scouts on our way to the cave. They did take us to the cave that formerly housed a petroleum tank.
This is definitely where the tank was. Yeah, you can see it's a wide open space where Kai's standing there. Circular. It's concrete, so that's the base of it. There we go. Yeah. You see how it's flat? So this is where it was. You can see the circle. Yeah, of course. All right, so we've definitely found the place where the tank was, because this is all cement.
Another source of revenue for the poor villagers and another war relic vanished into history. Before I take you to the other nearby cave where, 2 old petroleum storage tanks still survive, all empty, of course. I'm going to tell you a bit about the petroleum pipeline system. Through the mid 1960s, before construction of this pipeline system, fuel for trucks moving down the trail had to be hauled the same laborious way as everything else, in barrels on trucks, bicycles, and even bladders on men's backs. One 500-man unit literally carried petrol in rubber bladders, an effort so grueling it was quickly discontinued, and reports say some bladders ignited while on the backs of soldiers. Another way was to put petrol in barrels, floating them down the rivers. Although this worked to some degree during the rainy season, these methods simply could not match the fuel capacity the NVA needed. So, following these less than successful attempts to move petrol, Transportation Group 559 began transporting petrol entirely by truck and rail. Tanker trucks and 200-liter drum trucks moved fuel southerly from northern depots. But in 1967, U.S. bombing began to seriously impede fuel transport south, and the fuel supply crisis was severe enough that the North Vietnamese senior leadership began seriously discussing a pipeline as the only viable long-term fix for transportation. According to Vietnamese sources, the Soviets did not believe such a pipeline project was sustainable due to several factors, one being the U.S. bombing, and so did not provide any engineers and very little equipment for the construction effort. Group 559 began construction of the petroleum pipeline anyway in mid-1968. The North Vietnamese hub for this new pipeline originated at Cay Ve. Pipeline was laid across the mountains and petrol was pushed into Laos via the Mugia Pass down to Cavat, this segment completed by March 1969. The pipes were only 4 inches in diameter, lightweight, easy to hand carry through jungle and mountains, and pipes could be laid, camouflaged, and repaired quickly by hand labor gangs. No heavy machinery needed. The pipe came in light alloy and flexible plastic piping laid across the riverbeds or around karst where terrain did not permit trenching, and rubber hosing was used for rapid repair of the pipeline in the event of interdiction. The pipeline system and associated equipment consisted of pipes, pumps, control valves, observation globes, and gauges and storage tanks. The pumps had to be buried underground so any heat generated could not be detected by the U.S. AC-130s. The pipelines carried gasoline, kerosene, and various grades of motor oil. To get the different products through the same line, the NVA simply shut off the flow of whatever it did not need, injected a segment of kerosene into the pipe, and restarted the flow of whatever petroleum it needed. So, kerosene was the buffer between the petroleum products. The pipeline was strung across rivers and streams and over mountains more than 1,000 meters high, an extraordinary engineering challenge given it was all concealed and built under constant threat of air attack. But the effort succeeded, as one U.S. pilot famously said, "How do you see, much less hit, a 4-inch pipe with a fighter aircraft?" Some of the literature from Vietnamese sources on the exact routes of the pipelines is inconsistent and for good reason. The pipeline was constructed during war while under aerial bombardment and often changing tactical conditions. Additionally, because pipe links were laid by hand, the pipeline network was very nimble and could be rerouted without much additional effort. Pipeline was assembled, disassembled, and reoriented each year from 1968 on through the end of the war. And after the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam in 1973, the Mugia line wasn't even needed anymore and does not appear on the Transportation Group 559 official map for the period, which I will show you in more detail. Geopolitics was the start of the pipeline in 1968, and as I mentioned, it crossed into Laos through the Mugia Pass, fed into the growing West Krong Son pumping network. The pipeline picked up a second branch at the Bon Raving Pass, moving south towards the deadly Sapon area. This segment to Sapon was completed in December 1969, but this Bon Raving pipeline did not connect with the first pipeline that crossed over Mugia. The second branch allowed the North Vietnamese to accumulate huge petroleum reserves for distribution through the Lao Bao Pass towards Quang Tri and down into the Eshal Valley, as the petroleum lines did not cross over into these valleys. Some secondary sources say that by 1970, 6 separate pipeline strands were running into Laos simultaneously, giving redundancy against bombing, but there is no evidence of this in Vietnamese documents. The Soviets and Chinese supplied the petrol to the North Vietnamese by offloading petrol by ship to Haiphong, Vinh, and Dong Hoi.
Do you guys know your free forward bear so I can order? 5 Golf Mike, actually I'm in altitude, descend to maintain 1 White House.
The system was severely strained by renewed U.S. bombing in Operation Linebacker and mining Haiphong and other northern harbors, cutting off direct Soviet petrol tank deliveries by sea. In response, Soviet tankers began to unload petrol at a port in Guangxi, China, and in June 1972, the Soviets and Chinese assisted in completing a new pipeline from China with helicopters flying pipes and storage tanks to the Longsong Mountains to increase capacity. When the U.S. left Vietnam, the Soviets returned to their offloading in North Vietnamese ports, and the North Vietnamese continued to construct the pipeline until the pipeline terminated just north of Saigon, thus setting the condition for the North's eventual conquest of the South. The Vietnamese claim the petrol line eventually came to be about 1,400 kilometers in length, which is likely that part of the pipeline measured from Cay Ve southward on both the Lao and Vietnamese side. Fuel was moved along by 113 or so pumping stations with a capacity of roughly 600 to 800 cubic meters per day and distributed through 33 or so distribution stations, which we believe were also what the literature calls the fuel depots. Here is a map of the pipeline post 1973 from the official 559 history. It does not show the Mugia segment because that was no longer needed. The red numbers here represent road numbers, while the blue numbers are pipeline depots or stations. Note, because of the mountainous terrain, the Vietnamese pipeline section briefly crosses over into Laos again, and the Laos section, as I mentioned before, eventually crosses permanently into South Vietnam. The military advantage that the pipeline provided was that it allowed the North Vietnamese to project combat power deep into South Vietnam. And in what would initially seem illogical, CIA analysts found that the flow of supplies along the trail actually increased during periods of the heaviest bombing because the NVA kept developing more efficient logistics to compensate. Some of you recall from my writings and other videos that in July 1968, the U.S. Department of Defense concluded in one study that evaluated U.S. objectives, quote,
"The U.S. bombing in North Vietnam and Laos has no observable effect upon enemy force or activity levels in South Vietnam. Since 1965, the U.S. attack sorties against North Vietnam and Laos have increased about fourfold. Over the same period, the main enemy force has increased its strength levels by 75%, its attacks fivefold, and its overall activity ninefold.
This probably reminds you of the statement Vietnam War scholar Ronald Spector wrote about the war, which I have often quoted, and that was, quote, American policy had always been decided on the basis of considerations largely divorced from the actual situation in Vietnam. This North Vietnamese general transformed the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the formidable combined arms logistical system that it became and proved decisive in North Vietnam's conquest of the South. The pipeline's concealment was so effective that its scale was one of the more startling discoveries for U.S. intelligence, and Washington knew little about its length and specifications. Later, one U.S. verdict on the Ho Trail system, pipeline included, was that it constituted one of the great achievements of military engineering of the 20th century. Sometime after the war, when the petrol stopped pumping, the villagers began to disassemble the 4-inch lines, and now they use them as house supports and for other construction material. Now, let's look at the storage tanks inside the cave. Coming up, there is still much more for you to see and learn. The North Vietnamese poems and writings on the cave walls, more war litter, stories of the North Vietnamese women of the trail who sacrificed their youth, war stories, and an especially poignant segment, Death on the Trail. As you know, America exerts a lot of money and effort to bring home remains of its fallen around the world, prisoners of war accepted. The North Vietnamese have attempted to do the same in Laos, but with much less success through no fault of their own. We have dug deep into this, and I will tell you stories of how the North Vietnamese handled their war dead in Laos and then their subsequent efforts to bring remains home after the war. In closing, U.S. Marine Robert Garwood. I always get questions about him. Well, I have an answer. A friend of mine tracked him down in the Philippines, and Garwood opened up in an interview about American and French POWs, Garwood's story of captivity and release, and more. The video link is in my description. It is riveting. So, stand by for the next episode. Thank you for watching.